Galadriel is one of those characters who, despite having very little screen time, or page time, I guess, she generates so much conversation. She's the elf that launched 1,000 internet debates. Now, some of these conversations may be due to, extenuating circumstances, but even without that, the character of Galadriel has always been a bit contentious. And that's not just because of the fans. Her story underwent frequent and extreme revision well after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien just never seemed to quite be able to settle on who Galadriel is. And I think that makes it all the more interesting to compare and contrast her character from the book and from the movies, especially since Peter Jackson's version of the character in some ways lines up with alternative Tolkienian versions of the character. Now, I want to be clear that this is not a Rings of Power video, because, quite frankly, I don't really want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but towards the end, I am going to discuss a little bit about the inherent problems with trying to adapt a character like Galadriel in that medium. But you know what I would touch with a 10-foot pole, or dare I say it, an even shorter one, the food from this video's sponsor, HelloFresh. As much as I love being a hobbit, I do sometimes struggle to get in my square 7 meals a day. Between planning out meals, looking for recipes, buying food, I am wiped out by 11sies. But all of that has been made so much more manageable with the help of HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. HelloFresh removes the hassle from cooking by shipping recipes and fresh, pre-portioned ingredients right to your door so that you're only paying for what you need. And these meals are fully customizable, whether you're still mentally in summer and you're looking for something light and refreshing, or if you're like me and you've already mentally moved on to October and you need something really hearty. And if you're looking to meet health goals, you can choose from over 30 protein smart and calorie smart recipes each week. And as we all know, plans change and life gets busy, but luckily HelloFresh allows you to easily customize your delivery from week to week. You can adjust your delivery date and even skip weeks if you're not going to be home. If you want to give HelloFresh a try, click the link in my description or use my code right here to get 10 free meals plus free breakfast for life. That means 1 free breakfast item per box while your subscription is active if you're in the US, and if you're outside the US, your local discount will apply. Thanks so much to all of you for checking out my sponsors when I have them. It's how I'm able to keep doing what I love, and thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Galadriel was born before the sun and the moon in the years of the trees, when the elves still lived in peace and harmony in the holy place of Valinor. She's the daughter of the Noldor elf lord Finarfin, and she was known far and wide for her strength, her wisdom, and her overpowering beauty. The name Galadriel translates to maiden crowned with a garland of bright radiance, a reference to her astonishing hair. It was said to be as gold as the warm light radiating from the great tree Laurelin, shot through with the shimmering silver of Telperion. In her, these most holy lights mingled and blended together, becoming something even more profoundly beautiful. But she wasn't just beautiful, Tolkien writes. She was then of Amazon disposition, and bound up her hair as a crown when taking part in athletic feats. Ages later, when the Fellowship meets her in her kingdom of Lothlorien, her beauty and prowess have matured into something even more staggering. On 2 chairs beneath the bole of the tree, and canopied by a living bough, there sat side by side Celeborn and Galadriel. Very tall they were, and the lady no less tall than the lord, and they were grave and beautiful. They were clad wholly in white, and the hair of the lady was of deep gold, but no sign of age was upon them, unless it were in the depths of their eyes, for these were keen as lances in the starlight, and yet profound, the wells of deep memory. I actually think that the movie and Peter Jackson and his team did a really good job of capturing the sheer transcendent beauty of Galadriel. Director of photography, Andrew Lesney, actually set up a panel of little fairy lights or Christmas lights in these shots so that when we get close up of Galadriel's eyes, we see this sea of shimmering light the light of the two trees of Valinor reflected in her memory. And I think that this role was perfectly cast. Cate Blanchett finds a really great balance between ethereal, inhuman beauty and very grounded power and command. Her costume is highly textural, these layers of different white fabric. So even though it is monotone, even though it is only one color, it has so much depth and texture. It feels real. From head to toe, she simply radiates light every time she's on screen. They didn't give Galadriel a particularly deep voice, which the books mention that she has a voice that's deeper than most women's, but Cate Blanchett has such an open and resonant vocal tone that I still think it gets the point across. But we do start to see some differences once you compare and contrast what Galadriel actually says. In the book, where there's more time and space for her to speak, she is very selective with her words. She says to the Fellowship, "I will not give you counsel, saying do this or do that, for not in doing or contriving, nor in choosing between this course and another can I avail, but only in knowing what was and is, and in part also what shall be. But this I say to you, your quest stands upon the edge of a knife. Stray but a little, and it will fail to the ruin of all. Yet, hope remains while all the company is true." Later on, at the mirror, she clarifies, "I do not counsel you one way or the other. I am not a counselor. You may learn something, and whether what you see be fair or evil, that may be profitable, and yet it may not. Seeing is both good and perilous." This emphasis and this amount of specification cannot be found in the movies, but I find it to be a very important nuance. In the greater context of the story, Gandalf has just fallen in Khazad-dûm. His entire role was to be a counselor, to be a guide. It was literally what he was put on the earth to do, but it is not so for Galadriel. She'll offer you knowledge, she'll tell you what she knows using her hind and foresight, but she's not the new Gandalf. Her role is different. As she says, seeing can be both good and perilous, and it's not up to her to tell you which one is which. She can lend you her sight, she can give you knowledge, but she cannot tell you what to do with it. The movies don't have these lines outright. Instead, I think they skate by just by implying it. Everything about Galadriel, the pedestal that she's on, her inhuman glow, the reaction of breathless, speechless awe that we see from the Fellowship, all of these are visual cues to us as the audience that she is not the new Gandalf. She's not a particularly warm or outright friendly character. She's offering them shelter, but she's also offering them warnings. She gets around to telling them that the quest stands on the edge of a knife, but everything about the reactions to that, it shows how much of a blow this is to the already crumbling confidence and friendship of the Fellowship. I think it's fair to say that the Galadriel of the books is far more lighthearted and openly friendly than the Galadriel of the movies. She smiles, she sings, and in earlier drafts of the story, Tolkien was planning on having her laugh when Frodo presents her with the ring. Tolkien ended up giving this scene a bit more sincere gravitas, but he still chooses his words very carefully. "You will give me the ring freely. In place of the Dark Lord, you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark, but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night. Fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair." She lifted up her hand, and from the ring that she wore there issued a great light that illumined her alone and left all else dark. She stood before Frodo, seeming now tall beyond measurement, and beautiful beyond enduring, terrible and worshipful. Then she let her hand fall, and the light faded, and suddenly she laughed again, and lo, she was shrunken. a slender elf woman clad in simple white, whose gentle voice was soft and sad. "I passed the test," she said. "I will diminish and go into the west, and remain Galadriel." In the mouth of Galadriel, these words are not the ramblings of a madman. She says that she will be beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night. This means something because she was there when day and night were invented, when the sun and the moon were put into the sky. She knows how stunningly, blindingly beautiful light can be, and how paralytically terrifying the dark is. She has seen the waves and lightning tear the great human city of Numenor and all its thousands of souls under the sea. From her viewpoint on the precipice of history, above all of time and space, Galadriel would become everything. She would be the pinnacle of both beauty and horror, shining so brightly that the rest of the world around her would be plunged into darkness. The ring takes who you are and enhances it, and Galadriel is already so ancient and so primally powerful that with the ring, she would become so much more. To overcome this temptation, to overcome the draw of the ring, she must sacrifice that part of herself. She must bow her head and accept her destined role in creation, not as the arbiter of truth and light, but simply as Galadriel. The tone of this scene in the movie does differ. In order to capture this sudden magnification of power, they went more for, the scary route, and although it's different, I still think it works pretty well. Galadriel becomes a point of radiance as the rest of the light around her goes out, but instead of the pure white light that we've seen her in before, it's this sickly grayish green, more akin to the light we see emanating from Minas Morgul later on. She becomes something truly terrible, the dichotomy to Sauron, the Dark Queen to his Dark Lord. When she breaks free of that, it doesn't read so much as the bowing of her head, as surrendering her pride, but it reads more as exhaustion. It was a fight that she overcame, and now she's free. This approach is less nuanced and well thought out than what we have in the book, but this more dark and power-hungry version of Galadriel is far from unfounded. You see, Galadriel's backstory, especially at the time of the publication of The Lord of the Rings, it was pretty murky. Way back in Valinor, she had a bit of a contentious relationship with the other elves. Her uncle Fëanor became utterly obsessed with her beautiful hair, and he begged her again and again to give him just one strand from her head. She refused him outright 3 separate times, and after that, Fëanor went off and created his Silmaril gems, which also capture the light of the trees in a very similar way to Galadriel's hair. The rift that this caused between the two of them would never really be mended. And yet, when the 2 trees of Valinor were killed, and the world was plunged into darkness, and everything was in disarray, she found herself beginning to be swayed by his charisma. Fëanor spoke of the far-off continent of Middle-earth over the sea, of this wide-open, completely ungoverned land ready to be claimed and tamed by the oh-so-wise and powerful Noldor elves like Galadriel. Many elves were convinced to go with Fëanor, including Galadriel, and soon they struck out for Middle-earth. It wasn't long before Fëanor revealed his true self and began shedding blood almost at random, and Galadriel was utterly disgusted by this, and she and many other elves split off from him, but they still proceeded to Middle-earth on their own. They settled in Middle-earth, and Galadriel met her husband Celeborn, and they settled Lothlorien, fueling it with a seed of Valinorian magic. It is at this point that the canon starts to get a little bit messy. You see, in the Silmarillion, it's stated that the Valar did not explicitly ban Galadriel from returning, even though they did ban some other people from returning. The reason that she doesn't return to Valinor anyway is because of a voluntary exile. She decides that she had associated too much with Feanor and his ilk, and she likes Middle-earth. She likes Lothlorien, so she decides to stay. It is a completely voluntary exile. This baseline canon was what Tolkien had in mind when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. However, some 25 years or so after The Lord of the Rings had been published, he started fiddling around with this a bit. In The Road Goes Ever On, published in 1967, Tolkien retcons Galadriel's story. Galadriel was the last survivor of the princes and queens who had led the revolting Noldor to exile in Middle-earth. After the overthrow of Morgoth at the end of the First Age, a ban was set upon her return, and she had replied proudly that she had no wish to do so. In The Road Goes Ever On, in his letters, and particularly in his essay entitled The Shibboleth of Feanor, Tolkien places a very heavy emphasis on Galadriel's pride. She's too proud to accept the Valar's pardon, and she's too proud to give up Lothlorien after all the work she put into it. She finally has something that is her own pocket of magic, and she is far too proud to go home with her tail between her legs, so she remains banned from returning. By the time we meet her in The Lord of the Rings, she's plagued by the inherent elvish longing for the sea and for Valinor, but now there's nothing that she can do about it. And this idea is really interesting because it retroactively infuses a lot of tension into the existing scenes from The Lord of the Rings. As the Fellowship leaves, she sings her Namarie, her song of farewell, which speaks of long passing years of her cup which is nearly empty and will not be refilled. She longs for the sea, she longs to return to Valinor, and the city at its heart, Valimar. The last lines of her Namarie, her farewell song, translate to, "Now lost, lost to those from the east is Valimar. Farewell, maybe thou shalt find Valimar, maybe even thou shalt find it. Farewell." Galadriel misses her homeland terribly, and in this retcon version, it's not just that she's staying away from Valinor for personal reasons, she cannot return. This pain over the loss of Valinor is her penance for her pride. She wanted to have something of her own, she wanted a kingdom that was entirely hers, but as the years have dragged on, she's realizing just how much of a vain folly that was. This context also lends much more weight to the moment after she has the outburst over the ring. Suddenly small and meek, she says, "I pass the test. I will diminish, I will go into the west and remain Galadriel." Tolkien says that at this point, and then further compounded by the destruction of the ring, her ban from Valinor has been lifted. The test wasn't just there as an arbitrary step, it was her giving up her pride at last, cleansing herself so that she will now be ready to pass into Valinor. She was willing to diminish, to become less than the powerful queen that she could be, if it means that she gets to go home. In this context, this scene feels much larger. It feels like the conclusion to a centuries-long story arc. This new version of the story, in which Galadriel was actually banned from Valinor because of her pride, was what Tolkien stuck with for quite a few years. He tinkered with it here or there, but he seemed pretty happy with this new idea. That was until just a couple of months before his death, when he went back and decided on a new version of the story which completely erased all of that. Galadriel was unstained. She had committed no evil deeds. She was an enemy of Feanor. She did not reach Middle-earth with the other Noldor, but independently. Her reasons for desiring to go to Middle-earth were legitimate, and she would have been permitted to depart, but for the misfortune that before she set out, the revolt of Feanor broke out, and she became involved in the desperate measures of Manwë and the ban on all emigration. So essentially he's decided that she was banned from returning, but it was due to no fault of her own. This last-minute change and the seeming wiping away of any complexity with her character could be considered frustrating, and it is, but I think it's just ongoing proof that for Tolkien, there was no one specific canon. He wasn't writing this perfectly infallible, airtight book that some people seem to think he was. He had all of these ideas after he published The Lord of the Rings for how he could complicate the character of Galadriel, and he played with a lot of them. He put them in different published works, but in the end, he just couldn't justify this prideful, Spitfire redeemed character from his later notes with the kindly, gentle, and pure lady that he had first put in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I think that this final retconning, this claim that she was unstained and had not committed any sins of her own, was part of an effort for Galadriel to line up better with Mary, the mother of Jesus. As a Catholic, Tolkien had a very special and very particular dedication to Mary. She was the unblemished, immaculately conceived, sinless mother of God. And no, I'm not trying to say that Galadriel was the Immaculate Conception or the Mother of God, but her role in the story lines up very well with Mary's role in Catholicism. She is humble and radiant and wise, and while she isn't necessarily a counselor or a guide, she intercedes for people to God. She knows God, she knows some of his plan, and she can share that with people where she sees fit. This was a parallel that a lot of fans noticed, and it was something that Tolkien admitted to in his letters, and I think that this version of Galadriel, which is unstained and sinless, was part of an effort to make her line up more clearly and theologically accurate with Mary, the Mother of God. But something that I think the movie did really well was that they found a pleasant medium between the book character and Tolkien's original and final conceptions of Galadriel, and they were able to meld that with this middle version, the more complicated and complex version of Galadriel. Because as much as she is a Marian figure, there are parts of her that also nod back to the pagan world. She is this powerful and mysterious woman of the woods, a sorceress, feared by many, with the power to see things back in time and forward through time, and nobody's quite sure how she does it. She is both adored and feared, in large part because of just how mysterious she is. The idea of the mysterious sorceress, especially the mysterious sorceress in the woods, is a very popular trope throughout myth and literature. One of the best examples of this is Morgan Le Fay, the sorceress from the Arthurian myths, especially as she appears in the 14th century tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Morgan Le Fay is kind of a looming presence. She's not on the page. She's not actively there for most of the story, but we're given the impression that she's always watching, she's pulling the strings, and nobody is quite sure what she's planning. And yet we know that she has her hands in every part of the story. Her power is both beneficial and sinister. It's beautiful, but it's strange. And the mystique, the cloud of unknowability that wraps around her character is a big part of the appeal. So it is for Galadriel, who is revered and also feared. Her powers are known of, but never spoken of in anything above a whisper. Her power of seeing is, as she says, both good and perilous. I think that a more complicated, prideful, and fallen version of Galadriel meshes very well with this character type. It shows just how dangerous pure light can be. It's beautiful, but if you let it get too bright, it consumes everything. It can become the only light in a painfully dark world. Power is dangerous, but power paired with mystery and beauty is even more treacherous. It is in this sense that I think the movie portrayal of Galadriel works quite well. Her solemnity, the fanatical reverence that she brings out of people, the ominous undertones to her advice and her warnings. To me, Galadriel is a tough character because there's so much you can dive into about her. There's so much you can do with her character, so many different ideas you can explore, and yet she really only has a very short amount of time on the screen or on the page. And the glimpses that we get to see are incredible. She has this vast knowledge of the past, the future, and the present. By the power of her generosity and her kindness, when she gifts Gimli 3 hairs from her head, she manages to start the healing process between elves and dwarves. Her advice and her enchanted gifts are one of the things that pushes Frodo through his journey to the finish line. Even in her very short appearance, Galadriel establishes herself as an ethereal powerhouse, operating in the story in ways that we can't even comprehend. But maybe I find her so frustratingly fascinating precisely because we see so little of her character. It's like Tom Bombadil. If we fully understood him, if we sat down and got an explanation from Tolkien, so much of the intrigue that made them magical would be lost. She is this relic from the old world, but also a very real and tangible character. She is a saint, but she is also a fallible person. She is both Immaculate Mother and Fairy Queen, bridging the gap between the old world and the new, and honestly, I really like her portrayal in both the books and the movies. Galadriel's character is an excellent example of how adaptation can be used to expand a story. You can use the power of a medium to explore ideas that the original medium could not. So that brings us around to the Rings of Power show, and I think that one of their hardest tasks that was set out for them was trying to give us a close-up version of the character of Galadriel. It's not impossible to do. I mean, God knows Tolkien gave you a lot to pick and choose from when it comes to picking out her character traits, and I really do think that there is an absolutely fascinating character buried within Tolkien's notes. The problem that arises is that by making her a main character, making her someone that we have to get to know in order to invest in the story, you are inherently destroying some of the things that made people love her in the first place. Taking her in both the books and movies is like standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon. It's so vast and unknowable, and from your vantage point, you can't help but see it as something alive, something so astonishing in its entirety. But if you actually go for a walk into the Grand Canyon, you see these things up close, and they go from being a magical vista to being just wind and water, stone and sky. Again, I'm not saying that it can't be done well. I'm not saying that she's a character that shouldn't be explored. I really think there's something interesting to dig into. But the people that liked her in the books and movies are not going to like this character in the same way. She's going from being an incomprehensible fairy god queen to being a real person, or elf. But isn't that just the beauty of adaptation? It takes a story that we know and love and does something new and interesting with it, and I always think that's very fun. Like I said, I can't bring myself to choose between book Galadriel and movie Galadriel. She was like one of my favorite parts of the movie as a kid. I liked her more than I liked Éowyn just because I thought she was so cool. But let me know in the comments if you prefer book Galadriel or movie Galadriel, and why. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and consider subscribing if you want to come back here every week to hear me talk about stuff. You can go ahead and check out my Patreon if that's the kind of thing that you're into. I'm going to be on the Discord in these upcoming days talking about the Rings of Power way more than I'll ever talk about the Rings of Power on this channel. So, go ahead and check that out if you're interested. But either way, thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.